I'm Olivia Saunders. I'll be the moderator for this morning. And without further ado, I want to call on the president of Civil Society Bahamas, Dr. Anthony Hamilton, to say prayers, bring remarks. He'll be followed by Valerie Hamilton, who will do an icebreaker. No, he'll be followed by Ms. Omi Vieri, who will be coming through virtually. Dr. Hamilton.
Good morning, all. Good morning, all.
Good morning.
All right, that's better. Very good. That's a good way to get started. And we are grateful that you are present with us. Those of you that are joining us virtually, as well as those of you that are physically present in the room. And we're going to take a moment here to pause before we do an opening prayer. I'd like for us to enjoy a moment of silence, and then we flow right into it. A moment of silence, please. Our Father, we are indeed privileged to be in the land of the living. And even as we are in the land of the living, we are reminded of your love, your grace, and your mercies toward us. You, Father God, the author and finisher of our faith, our Father, our friend, our righteous and just judge. Lord God, we ask for your divine presence to permeate our beings, even as we spend this time this morning, being brought new knowledge with understanding that we may be properly prepared to execute. Now, Father, as we address the debt management matter for today, Father God, we pray that wisdom, knowledge, and understanding would flow. And each of us, Father God, would keenly make investments, even as information is provided to us, for the benefit of ourselves, individually and personally, but yea, for the wider community, yea, the Caribbean and the world. We bless you for this opportunity to be here today, Father God, to be focused, gleaning, that we may indeed exercise the ultimate responsibility with the information received. And we bless you now for good success as we go forward. In no other name but the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Again, I want to thank you for making the sacrifice to be here. This is indeed a keenly interesting topic that we're dealing with. And as I say that, there are three words that bring before us this morning in connection with that. The first being distress, secondly being debt, and thirdly, discontentedness.
CSB
As we capture those three words,
we cannot hear you.
I want to remind you hastily that the key to everything that we're dealing with is leadership. And today you are present as a demonstration of the fact that you are leaders because you made the sacrifice to be here, and there's an awesome responsibility you will assume as a result of being here today. I promise you this, you will not be the same individuals that enter this room when our time together is concluded today. I promise you that. As I say that, I would like to make mention of our international partners as we welcome those who are in the room, because we have a diverse representation with regard to the NGO CSO community of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And this is not a Nassau-centric exercise. I want to emphasize that. We have persons throughout the family islands. We have persons joining us from overseas, regionally and internationally. And so we're going to share together as the respective experts come to bring information to us. We want you to pay close attention to glean the information and then position yourselves to make use of the information, because each of us have something that we can contribute to this time today. And we want to empower you the more to be in a position to give further, as we've already been doing. The various NGOs, CSOs represented, the various community associations and the like represented, government officials likewise represented. We'd like to extend a warm welcome, in spite of our delay this morning with regard to the island-wide blackout. But the fact is, we are recovering. And in our recovery, things are going to be restored because we are resurrecting some things that are fundamental to the future success of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. I close with this. I want to remind us that we are in a season of celebrating our 50th anniversary of independence. 49 years later. And ultimately, in the midst of this, as we ask you to take another introspective look at the preamble of and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Bahamas. I say that again. I'd like to challenge you to take another introspective look at the preamble of and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Bahamas. Very, very, very important exercise as we reflect 49 years later and we move forward in our 50th anniversary of independence celebrations. Finally, people are the most important assets and investments of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. I repeat, people are the most important assets and investments of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. I thank you.
So the next presenter will be Ms. Geneva Oliveri, who's the Development Specialist at the Caribbean Policy Development Center.
My name is Geneva Oliveri, and I'm a Development Specialist at the Caribbean Policy Development Center. I see a full room. I also see a full house online. Your presence for me is indicative of your interest in regional development and national development. Over the last few years, the world has been thrust into crises that affected not just global health, but the global financial environment. Globally, there was as a result of this, we saw globally that there was an uptick in public borrowing as nations sought to shield themselves from the global shutdown and finance the public health crisis that we all face, all nations face. The Caribbean, with its inherent, long-standing vulnerabilities and debt crisis, was plunged into greater debt. The implications of the silent debt crisis that we were already experiencing and now having to borrow more really showed itself as being widespread. We saw it in our public sector. We saw it in our roads. We saw it in education. We saw it in healthcare. We saw it pervaded our society. But I wouldn't want to expound on that at this point. I would leave it to our esteemed speakers who are coming up. We have Jerome Phelps, we have Gerald Rambaran, we have a number of other Bahamian speakers who would be coming in to really let us know what the real state of play is, what the reality is. So I will let them develop those points. However, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Forge, Funders Organized for Rights in the Global Economy. They are our main donors, for seeing the importance of raising our awareness of debt in the region towards finding solutions. Thank you also to Civil Society Bahamas for being long-standing members of the Caribbean Policy Development Center and also very active members in regional development. We usually are very able to call upon them to make input into regional policy and other inputs that may be necessary. So we would like to thank you for your long-standing commitment. We'd like to thank Debt Justice as well, Debt Justice UK. You will be hearing from Jerome Phelps very soon for being a very formidable partner on this project. The challenge for us is to find solutions to this crisis, to engage our policymakers, to become aware of how debt affects us, that debt is real to us. It's not a government issue. It's a personal issue. It redounds to each and every one of us, to vulnerable groups, to the persons who were not vulnerable, who probably just teeter in the line. They were then pushed into a realm of being vulnerable. So I hope that today we are able to be made aware of what our reality is in the Bahamas and what our reality is regionally and what is necessary for us as Bahamians, as Caribbean nationals, to be able to move this discourse forward and find solutions. So I look forward to it. Thank you very much for being here and do have a fantastic session.
First of all, we have 15 minutes and we want to work in groups of 3. So everybody got their neighbor, you got your team. Students, do you have your 3s? Do we have our 3s? Come on, we're getting together here. Debt affects everybody. This is where we get into the weeds. All right, you're going to get involved. Before you begin to be instructed, we want a discussion. Okay, we got 3s. Good. All right, first of all, we want you to identify for each other the organization you represent. So identify your organization. Second, we want you to indicate the strength or the greatest achievement of your organization. What has your organization achieved that you're proud of? Third. All right, next one, key challenge concerning debt, whether it be personal, public, or both. What has been the challenge for your organization regarding debt? What has been your challenge, perhaps personally, that you want to share with your team members? Now, students, you may be saying, Miss, I ain't got no debt. But I assure you, you probably do. If you don't, your parents do, so guess what? That means you too. How does it affect the household? How does the lack of funding for things that you need, perhaps for your education, how does it affect you? Okay? And then we want to move into discussion on those questions. What are some solutions? What do you think we can do to solve those challenges and problems? All right, I'm going to ask, any volunteers want to share in particular, very briefly, a challenge and a solution. Challenge and a solution, briefly.
Thank you, Madam Icebreaker. Our group was the Civil Society Bahamas group. The challenge was personal savings, deficits, deficits meaning that we don't have enough to meet the demands of us. You know, we see so much need and the challenges come, but we don't have the means to do it. And from a public perspective, the government's deficit, borrowing, and the tax system. And in terms of the solutions, we said there needs to be order. In other words, there needs to be greater efficiency, structures that would ensure that there's the training, the knowledge, the skills building so that we can meet the challenges. Also, the ease of doing business, also communication, maximizing the resources that we already have. I mentioned already deficits, but sometimes we have resources within our organization that we're not really maximizing or tapping into. And lastly, generosity of spirit, that when we join organizations, civil society bodies, that our focus should not be what we're going to get from it primarily in terms of, say, building our profile, our businesses, but what can we give? Thank you.
Good morning. Our organization is a Catherine International Academy / a Catherine Ambassadors. One of our challenges is power usage. Even though that we are an organization that uses a lot of power, one of our solutions is that due to our organization being an organization that uses a lot of power, we can limit the usage of our power by introducing renewable energy and solar energy, such as solar panels.
No, y'all give him a hand, please. Thank you. Excellent. Excellent. Renewable energy. Someone else's hand? Oh, we have an online person. Please.
Good morning. Morning.
Good morning.
Donovan McLaren from Savoy Community Development Institute, Jamaica. Our challenges as it relates to, let's start with the latter question first, for us, is the engagement of member states, in particular civil society, as it relates to their respective countries' voluntary national report. This report speaks into the development of the SDGs and how each country is positioned positioning itself from the civil society perspective and their governments going forward. We tried to engage many member states earlier, and unfortunately, we only were able to engage 2 members from the Caribbean. We trust that going forward, more members would therefore participate not only in their respective countries, but be able to make a presentation at the UN at the next General Assembly on the high-level political forum on the VNRs. That's the latter. The former KCDI developed the first regional vocational training program, which is qualified at level 2 for grave diggers. Yes, there is now a vocational training level 2 being offered across the Caribbean for grave diggers, and that's a pioneering piece of work that KCDI has spearheaded along with Heart Trust NTA here in Jamaica. And for the first question that you had, what is our name? I stated earlier, KCDI Jamaica Limited. Thank you.
Thank you. Come on. Thank you, sir, very much. So the bottom line is, let's help each other by coming together. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
That presentation I thought was extremely interesting, and I'm going to be sure I heard what was said. Did the project that you have focus on establishing a program for grave diggers? I just want to be sure I heard the word grave diggers. Was that what you said, sir?
Correct. And
Excellent.
the formal name is Internment Operation, level 2.
Excellent. Can you give me a reason why you all started that project? I can guess, I suppose, but could you shed a little bit of light on that for me, please?
Thank you for that question.
That is really innovative for me. I don't know if anybody else feel the same way, but I'm really impressed. Okay, I'll sit and listen now. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the question. KCDI Jamaica looked in the space, which is across the region, and most interestingly, there is no formal mechanism to scale up grave diggers across the Caribbean. Grave diggers across the Caribbean are paid at the lowest level, and as such, they are treated as laborers. Under this new program, which will be scaled up to a CVQ, these grave diggers, official name internment operators, will now be paid at a professional level once they have completed the course. It will increase across the Caribbean their standard of living for themselves, their families, and their community. It is against this background KCDI saw the need and therefore spoke to the need to have such a program developed, not only for Jamaica, but for the English-speaking Caribbean right across the board. Thanks.
So I was asked to talk generally about debt, give an overview of the national debt of the Bahamas. And I'm going to start off by inviting you to, you don't have to do it right now, but if you're really interested in the national debt, to go to the Central Bank's Quarterly Statistical Digest, where you could get some current information. And if you go to the Bahamas government website, there are 2 publications that I recommend. One is the Midterm Debt Management Strategy, fiscal year 2023-24 to 2025-26, and the Government Fiscal Strategy and Priorities document. And there you would, although the date is December 22, you still should get a good picture of what our debt situation is about. And so because that those data are available online, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. I just want to make a few points that I hope takes your curiosity to go further. First of all, when we're talking about the Caribbean, you want to recognize that we are the most vulnerable countries in the world, not just from a climate perspective. And we all know from our experience in the Bahamas, the devastations of hurricanes. We know down in the Southern Caribbean, there are some serious issues with flooding, sea level rise, excessive rains, that sort of thing. Yes, we are very vulnerable from that perspective, but we seldom think of ourselves as being vulnerable from an economic perspective. And if we look just at the Bahamas, the level of dependency that we have in terms of our very survival for basic food and what all of our needs. We produce almost nothing for ourselves. This makes us extremely vulnerable to outside forces. And the Caribbean generally, economically, is a very dependent society. And when we have to purchase goods from abroad, it means that we have to find foreign exchange to purchase those goods. And very often, what we're producing internally is insufficient in terms of absolute money terms, but also in terms of the foreign exchange that's required to purchase those goods. So we end up in debt. So that's one point I'd like to make. The next point I'd like to make is that money is debt. And what this means is money is created out of thin air. It's essentially a fiction, and it's created through debt. The banks create a debt, and that debt on the books becomes money. And so this is the essence of the economic system that has prevailed since the 18th century and the development of the financial system. So the system requires debt. What happens, and what we have to really make a point about, is how do we manage within this system? The third point I'd like to make is identifying from a broad national perspective the essence of debt. It means that we are spending more than we are receiving. Our expenditure exceeds our revenues. And because of the system, the only way we could get around that is to borrow. And one of the concerns we should have about our economic system, not just domestically, but locally and internationally, is that when we are in our worst crisis, we must rely on digging ourselves in a deeper and deeper hole of debt, because that's how the system functions. So the sources of revenue for government. One, the government can sell off its assets. So for example, when we sold the majority shares in Patelco, or the controlling interest in Patelco, that was a government asset for which we received funds. If we were to sell land, buildings over government, that's be considered a source of revenue. Another source of revenue for the government would be taxation. And this is the main source of revenue that the government has access to. And this is extremely important because it boils down now to what is taxed, who is taxed, how much, and so on. And for us in the Bahamas, we have to have a great appreciation for the nature of our tax system. And we have to understand historically the basis of our tax system. There's a reason we don't really have direct income tax or wealth taxes, and taxes are primarily on consumption. because our entire economy was designed to ensure that rich people stay rich and the average person ensures that they stay rich. So the burden of our taxes lies primarily on lower income, middle income persons. The rich, the very rich and the wealthy, on the burden of their taxes, the taxes on them is extremely low compared to you and me. Because all of us say would buy a tin of cream or a gallon of milk. But me, as someone earning $300 a week, the amount of tax that I'm paying on that gallon of milk compared to the person who's making $3,000 a week, $3,000 a day is a lot less. So we have to look not just at the incidence of tax, i.e. who is being taxed and whatever tax rate, but who's bearing the burden. And Gawon the other day in the newspaper was talking about trying to get blood out of a stone. And it's correct, because when you look at the fiscal strategy that was produced, it's really not about tax reform. It's about how do we administer the existing system better. And the extent to which we administer this existing system better is more that we're going to get a heavier and heavier burden on the average Bahamian. And the last point I'd like to make before moving on to Mr. Rambaran is the idea of Jubilee. And I think somebody is going to talk about that, probably Mr. Phelps. But we talk about being a Christian nation, but in the Bible, there's something about canceling out debt. That's the Jubilee. And many countries have been asking, especially in the very poorest countries, to have a Jubilee, to cancel out debt. And whether this actually happens or not, we don't know. But what we do know is that the average Bahamian is in deep, deep, deep debt. The country is in deep, deep, deep debt. And we have to find a way out. So for example, in the, what document is this? This is a midterm debt strategy document. And I'm quoting, at the end of September 2022, the outstanding debt stock was estimated at 10,775 million, or 86.1% of the estimated annualized gross domestic product, compared with 100.9% at the end of June 21. So essentially, we're supposed to be getting better. So the GDP is telling us how much income we are producing in the economy. And that essentially is telling us what our capacity is to pay off any debt. So the fact that 86% of what your income is owed to somebody else tells you the extent to which you're in debt. But at the same time, I'm going back to the point that I'm making. We must in this country address the inequities of our tax system and require that those who can actually bear a stronger and higher burden of the debt. And that means meaningful tax reform, not just fixing the existing tax system that we have. So those are just a couple of points that I want to make. And we're going to move on now to Mr. Jawala Rambaran, who's a policy advisor with the Caribbean Policy Development Center. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, everyone. You allow me to make a presentation on solutions to debt trap in the Caribbean countries. Essentially, my presentation is one around this. I'll talk about what are the characteristics of our Caribbean countries that essentially pull more like development state. And then I'll speak a little bit about the Caribbean silent debt exit as renewable And I'll context that in relation to what the Bahamas looks like as well. Then we speak about some losses that much hurricanes in the Caribbean, because we're tying a lot of what's happening on that to the climate crisis. Then we look at what does the Caribbean external debt look like? How has that been gotten? What does it mean when you start to talk about debt restructuring and debt cancellation? And I'll speak to 5 potential climate finance solutions that support in relation to debt. And I'll close off talking about Caribbean Transition 2050, which is the sovereign debt and climate justice initiative that has been developed by the Caribbean Policy Development Center. So, when we talk about the Caribbean, I think we all remember, and this was actually with the initial remarks earlier, that we are small economies, and we're not only small in terms of economic size, but we also have a very narrow production and economic group. Most of the economies are really sector-type economies. Either we have tourism and business, or we have some agriculture, oil and gas. So essentially, our production base is very narrow. So export base is also narrow, and that makes us very susceptible to external shocks. We are also, and I think this is very important when we start to talk about financing, that we are considered a country, despite our vulnerability, we are considered by the international community graduated from concessional financing, from aid flows, and therefore that means we have to play into the big money. And we have to borrow if we need to borrow to fund the development. That borrowing will come on the international capital market. We also, I mean, have a number of other characteristics I think that quite relevant when we start to talk about debt. The region is one where growth has been stagnant for more than 30 years. We're not very competitive when we start to talk about the global landscape. And of course, the last two, our debt is unsustainable, and I'll show you why. And we're also very highly vulnerable to climate change, particularly hurricanes. And given our small size and given those characteristics and our vulnerabilities, as countries in the Caribbean, we continue to grapple with a number of external shocks that continue to hit us. Some actually occur almost simultaneously. And I've just showing here since 1996 what some of those shocks look like when we start to talk about Europe's phasing out of the preferential trade agreements for sugar and bananas. And we knew that that in itself hit the Eastern Caribbean countries in particular very hard. Right after 5 years after we had the 9/11 attacks that hit the tourism-based economies in the Caribbean, then we had the global financial crisis that was accompanied by a food crisis. Then, of course, in 2020, we had the unprecedented shock of the COVID-19 global pandemic. And right after that, 2 years later, we saw Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has generated a food and fuel crisis. And as we speak now, we are seeing rising interest rates in the global north countries that carry significant developments for our debt and our ability to manage and pay our debt on time. So so when we look at it, we're seeing a Caribbean landscape that continues to be faced with several shocks and that is in need of funding. Here's what the debt situation looks like in the Caribbean, and this is based on the most recent data from the IMF at the end of 2022 that was updated. And what it says is that 5 Caribbean countries now rank in the top 10 of the world's highly indebted SIDS. And the Bahamas ranks number 9 amongst the world's most heavily indebted SIDS. So the Bahamas is close to around 90, just over 90% of GDP. That's its debt to GDP ratio. So that is extremely significant. But what this also tells you is that the region as a whole is one that is highly indebted. And then if we narrow in a little more on what that debt looks like, we find that 6 Caribbean countries now have public debt that's greater than 90% of their GDP. And this chart actually shows you that ranking, starting with Suriname, which is now the most heavily indebted Caribbean country, and goes all the way down to Guyana. The Bahamas ranks number 5 amongst the most heavily indebted Caribbean nations. Now, I've done this chart in a particular way where you see the countries that have debt to GDP greater than 90%, they're all in red. Then the ones that have debt between 60 to 90% of GDP, they're in orange. And then you have 3 countries whose debt is below 60% of GDP. So that's considered basically sustainable. What this chart actually says is that those other 5 countries whose debt is between 60 to 90% of GDP, once the shocks that I've spoken about continue or new ones occur, then and there is little effort made to deal with this untenable debt situation, then it's quite likely you could see some of these countries migrating from orange into red. And unless the countries that are in red take significant action to reduce, cancel, or restructure their debt, then they are likely to continue in that red zone. So this speaks to the gravity of the situation that's facing us as a region when we start to talk about debt. And if we have to now link that to climate change, what we've seen over the last 70 years or so is that the Caribbean region has been disproportionately affected by more frequent and intense hurricanes, especially since the 1990s. And that's what this chart is basically telling you. Over the last 70 years, we've had, and this is up to 21, I haven't updated this for last year, we've had 423 named storms. Of those named storms, 216 became hurricanes, and at least 100 became major hurricanes, meaning category 3 or higher. So that's a significant amount of climate change activity to deal with. And when we now look at the loss and damage, we've put a table together with those for those countries what the loss and damage would look like. We've put the dollar value in constant terms because we've gone back over 70 years. And what that says is that Caribbean SIDS have suffered over $30 billion in loss and damage from hurricanes over the past 70 years. And as you quite rightly know, the Bahamas suffered nearly $8.5 billion in hurricane damages over the past 70 years. That's in constant dollars. And of course, Hurricane Dorian in 2019 was the most destructive, and that hit was equivalent to almost 25% of the country's GDP. Right? Now think about it. Hurricane Dorian in 1 year caused a hit equivalent to a quarter of the country's GDP. The debt at the moment amounts to 90% of GDP. So out of that, in that 90, 25% is the equivalent to what Dorian did in 1 year. That again shows you the gravity of the situation that Caribbean countries have to grapple with, and what the Bahamas is actually grappling with at the moment. Let's just talk about how the face of the debt in the Caribbean has changed. Traditionally, whenever Caribbean countries started borrowing right after independence, they would borrow from the former colonial masters, particularly the UK, and that expanded after to the US and Canada. What happened around the 1990s is that these traditional Western donors began to redirect their lending of aid away from the Caribbean and towards what we call the low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa and some of the post-conflict countries that were experiencing more severe challenges in their view. And that meant there was a reduction in financing from what is known as the traditional Paris Club group, which is the group of global north countries that have traditionally lent to us in the global south. At the same time, as I mentioned, we began graduating from being low-income countries to being mid-income countries, and therefore it meant we were no longer eligible for concessional financing. And as this happened, and as the traditional Western donors sort of retreated, China appeared and began to take on a greater role in the region. And China's lending to the Caribbean has essentially begun to replace much of the lending that countries like the UK, the US, and Canada did early in the 90s. Around that time, too, what we saw were Caribbean countries began to get credit ratings from the rating agencies such as Moody's and Standard & Poor's, and they began to tap the international and the local capital markets for funding. And those countries that did not have credit ratings or did not have a credit rating that made it possible to borrow to such an extent, they began to turn more to the IMF and the World Bank and what we would call the regional development banks, such as the IDB and the CDB, to fund their development projects. And over time, up to 2020, this meant that we've reached a point where the Caribbean now has an external debt stock of about 30 billion US dollars. Most of that debt is owed to what we call private creditors, especially the international markets, meaning we could just, for that term, we could call that the Wall Street players. And the Bahamas now owes about US $5 billion in external debt to private creditors, again, especially in the capital markets. So the table on the left shows you what the Caribbean debt looks like by the major creditors. Your first set of creditors are actually called the bilateral creditors. Those are who you borrow from, the countries that you borrow from. And those creditors are essentially what we call the Paris Club group of major global north countries. And then you have the non-Paris Club group, which here in the Caribbean is dominated by China. Then you have your multilateral creditors, who are essentially the IMF. And then you have the other international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, the IDB, and the CDB. Your final set of creditors are what we call the private creditors. So those are either the banks, the international banks, or the capital markets players. And when we start to talk now around, and this particular structure is important and highly relevant, because when we start to talk about debt restructuring, debt cancellation, debt forgiveness, we now need to decide who are the creditors that we're speaking to and who are the creditors that we're going to engage in when we start to talk about these matters. And what you'll see here is that the first thing is the bilateral creditors. Traditionally, they've been approached through what we call the Paris Club arrangement, where you go up to Paris, meet with these creditors, and they decide on a rescheduling. China is now starting to play a role in discussing restructuring arrangements, but mainly with countries in Africa. It hasn't done so with any country in the Caribbean. The multilateral creditors, on the other hand, because they carry in the what we call preferred creditor status, essentially their debt is not up for negotiation, is not up for restructuring. And the private creditors now, when you start to talk around restructuring with them, these are a diverse and powerful group of creditors. And generally the experience is they will always have the upper hand. So it becomes is a very difficult landscape for any Caribbean country to navigate when we start to talk about debt restructuring. So what are some of the solutions then, given this situation that we face? And CPDC is actually working on 5 main climate finance solutions in terms of its advocacy work. One is the need for greater concessional financing for Caribbean SIDS, and that finance should take into account the multi-dimensional vulnerabilities of these countries. And I've talked about, the nature of the SIDS. What are their economic characteristics? The second is the need to deliver comprehensive debt relief, including maybe debt for climate swap as a form of climate reparations. And here, CPDC has developed Caribbean Emancipation 2030 as a model that could be used, and I'm going to speak about that in closing remarks. The third call is that we need to establish and make fully operational as soon as possible the loss and damage finance facility that was agreed in November last year at COP27. But our call is that this form of climate finance must be concessional and must be aligned to the needs of Caribbean SIDS. So again, what we're calling for is more concessional funding and not loan-based funding. The fourth call is that there are some instruments that essentially emanate from the IMF that is conditionality-free and is debt-free. It's called special drawing rights. And we're asking for a rechannel of at least $1 billion of those to go to the CDB. And then the CDB will now fund projects for Caribbean countries, but that funding will be debt-free and conditionality-free. So that, again, that's a major change from how the CDB operates. And the fifth call is that there's a new instrument, concessional funding actually, that the IMF has introduced called the Resilience and Sustainability Fund. And we're asking for a review of this fund to make it more fit for purpose. But that review should be done after we've looked at the experience of Barbados, which has formally entered into arrangement with the IMF to draw down on the RSF. And Jamaica, which has what we call staff level agreement, is yet to get final agreement on the RSF. So those are the 5 main calls that CPDC is making and will continue to make during the course of this year as we try to find solutions to the debt and climate trap that is facing Caribbean countries. And I just want to end off talking quickly about Caribbean Emancipation 2030, which is a sovereign debt and climate justice initiative that CPDC has developed. And there are essentially 3 objectives around Caribbean Emancipation 2030. One is to give Caribbean SIDS the ability to negotiate substantial reductions in debt, to restore them to a level of solvency, and to put an end to the Caribbean's 30-year-old silent debt crisis. The second objective is to allow them to issue new green bonds that will give them access now to the international capital markets to help with their climate financing needs. And the third is to encourage Caribbean countries to pursue economic reform, but link that reform to debt relief and climate resilience that is aligned to the commitments that these countries have made in respect of their 2015 Paris Climate Arrangement. And we've called this Caribbean Emancipation 2030 simply because we want a message that fits deeply with the values of Caribbean society and communities. We want a message that says Caribbeans is a special group of countries and at the crossroads of two interrelated crises, sovereign debt and climate change, and therefore we need to find a solution. We're using the word emancipation because it really signifies a commonality across the Caribbean in terms of the most significant event that has affected the region in terms of its history. And it also offers a powerful symbolism of breaking the chains of slavery and breaking the bondage of debt. And this in a way is also linked to it is inspired by the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which Jerome will speak about later. He may speak around that. We're also asking for the need to link that debt relief to the need for reparations. And this is, of course, an argument that has been going on for at least the last decade in CARICOM. And there's now an opportunity where countries are actually, some countries, former colonial countries, are actually coming forward and acknowledging the fact that they may have to pay reparations. And then 2030, of course, would link that the campaign to the SDGs, which is the period when the SDGs comes to an end. So it gives a sense of urgency that, look, we really have less than a decade to find a solution, a meaningful solution to the debt crisis that's facing the Caribbean countries. And I'll just speak one more round let's see, on the advocacy. I take my computer seems to have frozen here. And just to end, there's an entire advocacy campaign that has in a sense been drafted by CPDC, and that is one that CPDC is considering and is likely to move this out and roll this out during the course of this year.
Thank you. Good morning, sir. How are you doing? Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative, very enlightening. I have two questions. One, what is the primary purpose or use of the CPDC's concessional funding geared toward? That's the first question. And the other question is, would you consider changing the name of the initiative? The word emancipation for me instills in the European Union's mindset a group of people that are dependent, that was once enslaved and seeking concessions. Perhaps maybe the word investment could be considered, because you know these are business people, these investors and bankers, and they're looking to make returns on their money. And there's a tremendous amount of opportunities in the Caribbean, just for suggestion. I had a couple other points, but I didn't want to take any more time. Thank you.
Right. Just remember given that the debt, and this is something that we need to bear in mind. As I showed you there, the debt in the Caribbean is diverse. There are a number of different creditors, and therefore you have to have a multifaceted approach to treating with the debt. We can't only just say, well, we're asking for one thing only. Because even if at the end of the day we said, well, let's ask to cancel the debt, right? That's fine. That's a proper negotiating tactic. At the end, we still need to know where we're going to land on that table, because there are other moving parts that are taking place in the international system, right? As a region, the Caribbean has fought tremendously to get the loss and damage facility, right, on the table. Now it means we can't give that up, right? So we have to fight for that. So that's why you see CPDC is asking for the loss and damage, because if we look at the world of climate finance, much of the climate finance that comes goes for mitigation. But we don't generate significant greenhouse gases. We are less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So we're not significant emitters. What we need to do is we need to adapt, and we also have to deal with the issue of climate change that has already affected us. That's the loss and damage. So you've got to be fighting on that front, right? And what we're asking for is when you get the funding for loss and damage, it must not be in the form of loans, because loans is the debt that has put us in this situation. The term used is concessional funding, which is long-term funding that goes out all 30 years. So it matches at basically next to nothing in terms of interest rates. So it matches, in a sense, the time profile that you really need to deal with climate change. Remember, the targets for climate change are actually set into 2050. Right? So that's the kind of window that we're looking at.
Thank you so much for the invitation to present to this event. We're very excited to work with Civil Society Bahamas and with CPDC on really bringing Bahamian and Caribbean civil society voices to the global debate on the unsustainable debt crisis. I think I'll speak for a few minutes about more of the covering some of the same ground as Juwala, but from more of a global perspective, where the debt crisis is increasingly high profile, urgent political issue. And I think there's a really critical need for stronger Caribbean presence, stronger Caribbean civil society voices within that debate. So I'm based in London. I work for Debt Justice UK, which is an organisation that grew out of the Jubilee 2000 campaign from 23 years ago that Juwala mentioned, which was a major global campaign for large-scale debt cancellation on the basis of this biblical notion of the Jubilee that was mentioned earlier, the notion that when debts can't be paid, when it would be unjust for debts to be paid, they should be written off. So we work with with partners across the Global South to influence policy, to campaign, to build political pressure for justice, for just solutions to the debt crisis that's affecting large parts of the Global South, but particularly is particularly critical in the Caribbean. It is, as Juwala was explaining, the debt crisis is a global crisis. There are 54 countries in debt crisis, according both to UNDP and our separate analysis. Many of them are small island developing states, but increasingly we're seeing increasing defaults of major economies, like Sri Lanka, for example, ran out of reserves and defaulted in the summer at massive cost to people and communities in the country. Pakistan is currently having endured the massive costs of the flooding as a result of the climate emergency over the last summer, is now on the verge of default as well. It's negotiating with the International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. So the situation really is critical in many countries. It's simply not going to be possible for them to carry on paying their debts. Why is that? There's been, as Joala sketched, there's been several years of low interest rates have meant there's been a lot of cheap money flowing around the global economy. Investors have been looking for countries they can lend to at high interest rates based on the higher risk profile. So global south countries are seen as riskier, so they get charged higher interest rates. Basically, investors, there's been an increasing profile, as Joala said, of private lenders, bondholders who've taken a risk on lending to countries in the global south. We've then hit the pandemic. We've hit the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has sent food and fuel prices spiraling around the world. We've had a series of intensifying climate-related extreme events around the world, but including in the Bahamas. So this has tipped many countries over the edge. It's meant that their debts, which previously seemed sustainable, now they're having to pay much higher interest rates as the Federal Reserve, the US Fed, increases interest rates. It's a perfect storm of different intersecting pressures that have meant that those debts become unpayable. The lenders who took a risk have lost effectively because those debts can't be paid. But there's still this massive question as to how those debts get restructured, whether it's at the cost of austerity for communities, or whether this range of creditors, governments, Paris Club governments, China, IMF, World Bank, and private creditors can coordinate to write down their debts in a structured way, and whether we have we get loss and damage climate finance, grant-based climate finance that can enable countries at the sharp end of the climate crisis to deal with the impacts of the climate emergency without taking on more and more debt each time they're hit by a hurricane. Otherwise, in the absence of any bankruptcy system for states, unlike companies, states have no clear route out of the hole of unpayable debt. This has been recognised, the debt crisis has been recognised at the highest levels as a major threat to global economic stability. In response to the pandemic in 2020, the G20 developed two initiatives, that were intended to address the global debt crisis, being the Common Framework and the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. They were inadequate. They were criticised at the time by civil society as inadequate, and they've largely failed. Not least because they excluded many middle and high income countries that have both the biggest debt challenges and are at the sharp end of the climate crisis. And they failed because they were designed by rich lender countries in the G20, bypassing UN spaces where Global South, where debtor countries have a voice, in order to develop the response around the interests of rich creditor countries. The Debt Service Suspension Initiative in 2020 to 21 paused some debt payments, but only by bilateral lenders, effectively by governments. So the Caribbean countries that, as Joala explained, are mostly no longer borrowing from the traditional Paris Club Western Global North governments. They're borrowing from private lenders who didn't participate. So Caribbean states got less than 3% of the debts they applied to suspended. And private creditors only, in general, suspended 0.2% of the payments. The longer term solution of the G20 to the debt crisis was the common framework, which was intended to be a structure to enable all creditors to come together in a quick and structured way around debt restructurings that write off some debts, and in a fair and transparent way for all creditors. Again, middle high income countries largely excluded, including many of the most indebted Caribbean and SIDS countries. There was no process to compel private lenders to participate, so they're largely dragging their heels in the hope that they will be effectively bailed out by new IMF loans, by effectively public money coming in to enable countries to keep paying off their private creditors. Only three countries now, actually, in fact, going on. Ghana is in the process of applying, so that will be 4 countries applying for the common framework. But in 2 years, no debt has actually been restructured yet. It's been largely almost complete failure. Zambia, for example, has been negotiating for 2 years and is still deadlocked. China is a major creditor to many of these countries. China is demanding that private creditors, but also the multilateral lenders, IMF and World Bank, also take a similar hit on their lending, which is causing deadlock at the moment. So it's not working. We need more radical solutions. So the global debt movement, which debt justice is very involved with, which includes regional networks in every region of the world. We're hoping that the CPDC networks can become the regional voice of the Caribbean in this movement, is amplifying the voices of people, communities affected by the debt crisis to demand solutions that actually resolve the crisis, that cancel debt where it needs to be cancelled, and that there be a structured debt workout mechanism that enables states, similarly to a bankruptcy process, where they can't pay their debts, to renegotiate, write down those debts in a fair and transparent way with all creditors, so they don't lurch from one restructuring to the next, as happens for many countries. There needs, likewise for concessional finance and grant-based finance, there needs to be a multi-dimensional vulnerability index that bases access to finance not just on income levels, excluding Caribbean countries in many cases, but also on other factors, including vulnerability to the climate emergency, which is generating these massive costs for countries like the Bahamas. And one particular focus that we're working on in the UK is to propose legislation for to incentivize private creditors to participate in debt restructurings, so that they can't hold out and then refuse to participate and then get paid the full amount out of the goodwill of other creditors who have participated. So it's effectively a way of giving teeth to the common framework. This can be done in the UK and the US because the vast majority of private debt contracts are governed by English or New York law. So we're trying to get some pressure on the UK government, potentially the next UK government, to legislate in order to make it easier for countries in difficulty to restructure their debts. And we're working very closely with partners in the climate justice movements to push for both as Joala was saying, grant-based climate finance and loss and damage, so that countries aren't taking on debts to pay for climate disasters. And also there's clauses that can be inserted into loan agreements that automatically suspend debts when there's a hurricane, for example, so that countries are not forced to divert desperately needed resources from emergency response to carry on paying their creditors. I'm going to stop there. Many thanks for again for the invitation. I don't know if there are any questions.
Hello? Is there a question? Okay, thank you, Mr. Phelps. Oh, there's a hand up over there. You'll take one question.
Good day. I wanted to, from your experience, giving us a truthful answer. Can the Caribbean see themselves getting out of debt from our colonial powers? And the reality is that we all know that the borrower is a slave to the lender. It seems to me that the system that is created in our modern times is just a modern day financial enslavement, economic reality to our people and the future of our people.
So the ultimate question is it realistic to think that we could get out of this debt?
I think if that's. Thank you very much for raising that point. I think the colonial background to the debt is absolutely critical. Many, as Joala hinted, many countries on independence had economies structured in the interests of colonial powers around export dependence, a lack of balanced economies that would be shock resistant, and that's the structural reason why they've been exposed to these debt traps. And I think that I think it's realistic. I think that there is this growing recognition of awareness of the need for colonial reparations to address enslavement and the whole history of unjust economic exploitation and extraction, and that the current debt situation is simply the current iteration of this long, deep history of extraction, exploitation of formerly colonized countries. I think, and the pressure for loss and damage, the pressure for reparations are different the pressure for debt cancellation are different aspects of this demand for justice. I think in a UK context, there is this strong historical connection with the Caribbean, which makes Caribbean voices particularly effective at making that demand that the UK needs to play a role in addressing its past responsibility for exploiting the Caribbean. We're very keen to work with partners to get the narrative of colonialism as a key part of why we need debt justice. We've produced a video. We're doing various materials around bringing out the story of debt and colonialism, which I'll put in the chat, at least for people online. The Haitian example is the most obvious, where Haiti was extorted a vast debt to pay compensation for for the loss of property in enslaved people to France, and was paying that debt for 150 years after independence. So I think that the connection between debt, colonialism, and that history is absolutely critical, and that's one of the strengths of the demand for debt justice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good answer.
Yes, am I being acknowledged for a question?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I would like for Mr. Fowles, thank you for your presentation. Appreciate it. I want you to develop the thought that you made about the biblical notion of Jubilee. Can you give further substance to that comment?
Yes, another very good question. The notion of the Jubilee is a notion that goes back to the Bible. The idea of a Jubilee year where debts are written off. People who've been literally in the past literally enslaved to their creditors can have their debts written off through a declaration of a Jubilee. And that's I think that was a really valuable framing for in 2000 when we had the last global debt crisis. There was this huge coming together of faith groups, justice groups, communities around the world to demand a debt jubilee as a way of, and again this goes back to the point made earlier, not asking for not begging for debt forgiveness as a debtor, but asking for justice, asking for a just solution that can write off debt that's actually impossible to be paid, in accordance with long traditions that go back actually even beyond the Bible to the origins of Mesopotamia and the origins of urban civilization. There's always been this notion of debt jubilees. The idea that debts always have to be paid is a much more recent and very problematic one. And I think we need to, that biblical notion is a really powerful one to hang on to.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Good morning again to everyone. I have a very simple question, and it's very, very simple. But I noticed that you have in your solutions, I think the first thing that I jotted down was cancellation. My question then would be, if a debt is canceled, who would lose the most or who would gain the most? And if the debt is not paid, would it be detrimental to the lenders? And that's very simple. Because if you have someone owes you, and even if you go to court and they cannot pay, I mean, it's a way for making them pay, but they still owe you. But you realize that in the Bahamas, we say you're barking up a dead tree or something like that, because you're not going to get it back. So I think if we could explain to me what would be the greatest or the worst impact of cancellation on the lender. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think there's a fallacy that debt cancellation is not in the interests of lenders, and they'll never agree to it. Actually, what we're calling for is fair debt cancellation that spreads the burden between the debtor society, which is inevitably suffers when there's a debt crisis, and the full range of lenders, so that lenders who have lent at high interest rates, particularly private creditors and bondholders, should, by fairness, and take the biggest haircut on their, should cancel a larger proportion of their lending than, say, a multilateral the IMF or a multilateral lender that's lends at a very low concessional interest rate. So it's about doing it in a fair way. If a debt's unpayable, it's not going to be paid anyway. It's not in creditors' interest to wait indefinitely for a country that owes 100% of GDP to somehow get to the point it can pay its debts. If the country defaults in a chaotic way and stops paying, the creditor is at risk of losing everything. If we have an unfair, chaotic restructuring, some creditors might feel that they might agree to restructure their debts, while others, vulture funds, for example, hide and then get paid in full. That's unfair. That creates a competitive advantage for vulture funds and badly behaved creditors. It's actually, and also lenders have a long-term interest in being able to lend again in future. It's in no, if a country like Bahamas has a huge debt that makes it hard for it to keep lending, that means that squeezes out investment, and that makes it very difficult for the private sector to keep investing in the country, because there's this fear of a default hanging over. So it's in everyone's interest to do it in a fair, transparent, structured way that doesn't impose austerity and prevent growth and development in the country. It's also in every creditor's interest to free ride and let other creditors take the hit. So that's why we need structures that can reassure creditors that if they cooperate, they won't be the victim of free riding by other creditors.
Thank you. You have a question? Yeah, we're trying to move it on a little quickly because of time.
I guess I'm the last question. What I wanted to find out is the amount of interest that somebody that borrows money pays. Most of the time, if you look at the amount of interest that that person would have paid, is they would have paid the amount that they owe plus the amount that they give. Sometimes it's double. So I'm just wondering if that is the case when it comes to cancellation. They already got their money most of the time.
Thank you. That's a great point. It's actually worse than that, because many of the holders of Bahamian debt, for example, these bonds have been sold on many times. A country with distressed debt, its bonds are being sold at 30% of their face value. So if I buy a Ghanaian bond today, and I eventually get paid in full, I will make a 300% profit. And in addition to getting often 7 to 10% interest annually, if the country is considered at risk earlier or already. So private lenders are gamblers. They're gambling that they can make big profits by lending irresponsibly sometimes to governments that are struggling with high debt. And they're gambling that public money, new IMF loans will pay them off anyway, and they can make huge profits because the costs get transferred on to communities as conditions of loans having to implement austerity policies. So that's why it's that's why it's not a asking it in the context of all the crises that we've experienced over the last 2 years. Debt cancellation is the normal realistic compromise solution. It's not a radical demand for forgiveness. It's a recognition that many of these loans are not sustainable in the first place.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Can we give Mr. Phelps a hand? Very thorough responses. So we're going to move on now. Our next presenter will be Mr. Shivago Lang.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saunders. I trust you can hear me well. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you very much. I rather enjoyed listening to the previous speakers, who I thought made excellent presentations about the global regional debt scenario. I'm asked to look at the question of impact of the national debt on the economy and entrepreneurship. Let me start by saying that this issue of debt management, or ultimately what it boils down to is the issue of debt burden, goes back decades. Discussions about what is to be done about it, how it evolves, it has gone back decades, being examined by all and sundry, even to the extent of, is there really a debt burden as such? Or is there really a transfer of that burden to future generations? So that's how long-standing, how dynamic the discussion around this issue has been. No matter how long-standing the concerns about national indebtedness and sustainability have been, though, debt continues to be an instrument of public fiscal policy for most countries on the globe, and persistently so. So whatever the crisis, whatever our concerns, countries are not relenting on using debt as a means of financing their national development ambitions or aspirations. Global debt now stands at more than $300 trillion, according to the World Economic Forum 2022 report, which is about 94.4% of global domestic product. So if you wanted to know what the global debt is as a percentage of the global domestic product or the global income, it stands at about 94.4% according to the IMF 2022 report. The regional story on debt is quite stark. Barbados' debt, for instance, went from $1.2 billion in 1994 to about $6.9 billion in 2021, which is about a sevenfold increase. The debt to GDP from 56.9% in 1994 to 135.4% in 2021. And the debt per capita from $4,621 to about $23,936 from 1994 to 2021. The Bahamas' debt went from just about $1 billion in 1994 to $10.2 billion in 2021, which is a tenfold increase in the debt. The debt to GDP ratio went from about 21% in 1994 to about 100%, depends on who you argue with these days, or a little under 100% in 2021. And the debt to GDP per capita went from $2,706 in 1994 to about $25,615 in 2021, which is now equal to the per capita income of the country. So the per capita debt is equal to the per capita income. Antigua and Barbuda, smaller jurisdiction among the Caribbean countries, went from $528 million in 1994 to $1.4 billion in 2020, which is about a doubling of their debt. The debt to GDP rose from 89.9% in 1994 to about 101.5% in 2021. Why this persistent reliance on debt? Why this persistent march toward debt? I can't believe that the people who borrow on behalf of countries, which are the politicians who elected and politicians who occupy cabinet posts, because those are the ones who bring the debt instrument to the parliaments of the countries and get approval for the borrowing. So why this persistence in borrowing, notwithstanding all that we have heard about the crisis, the ensuing, all that we have heard about this enslavement to colonial powers and the abuse that these lenders may exact upon countries? How is it that supposedly intelligent people continue to borrow? Why do they do that? Because notwithstanding that we have a history that has brought us to a debt crisis, we say, the borrowing continues. They'll be borrowing this year, they'll be borrowing next year, and so forth and so forth. Why is that? Well, it may have something to do with the fact that when you look at at countries and their Human Development Index as an example, the chase for that high Human Development Index leads countries to spend very often more than they earn. And it is the spending more than you earn that leads ultimately to a deficit. Meaning, you spend money you don't have, you now have to pay for the expenditure over and above what you spent. And that can only happen by two ways. It can only happen by taxing the population, by saying to the population, I need more money so that I can pay for these additional things over and above what I got from you before. Or you borrow the money. You go to someone with an excess of funds and say, can I borrow from you some money so I can pay for this over expenditure? It has been the case in the Caribbean, I suspect more for political reasons than not, that we continue to go toward borrowing as opposed to taxing, because taxing comes with political consequences, significant political consequences. So as an example, some of you who live in the Bahamas may recall, for decades, a minister of finance prided himself, and I have to say himself because we've not had a female minister of finance, prided himself with coming to the parliament and saying, I am happy to report that there is no new taxes or increases in taxes. And everyone in the parliament would bam their hands on the tables and make a ruckus. And no doubt the population said, hallelujah, thank the Lord. There was no new taxes and no increases in taxes. Well, the price for that is a deficit, which will be funded by borrowing in this chase for development, in this chase for providing the public with things that the public says and the politician believes the public would want. And so once you get to this borrowing, the stock of that borrowing, the buildup of that borrowing becomes the national debt. Some of the borrowing is provided by domestic players. In the case of the Bahamas, as an example, the bulk of it is provided for by, say, the National Insurance Board. There are insurance agencies, there are institutional investors, pension funds that also become part of this lending to the government. And then the other portions of it become foreign players, other foreign pension funds and the like, who also lend to the government. Historically, the Bahamas has had a smaller share of its borrowing owed to foreign institutions, even though that has been increasing in recent times. And so we've been largely buffered from external shocks against our borrowings because of a low foreign indebtedness. That has changed, but it has been a recent change since 2007, 2008, the Great Recession. The profile, both in terms of our debt to GDP ratio and in terms of our indebtedness to foreign entities, has increased significantly since then. So we build up this national debt. So the question I've been asked to answer is, what's the impact of this national debt on the economy and entrepreneurs? I start with entrepreneurs first because really it's the entrepreneurs that largely drive the economic enterprise. I mean, the consumers are a big part of it, but the entrepreneurs are the providers of the goods and services to those consumers. So I start with the entrepreneurs, and here's the temptation. The temptation is to think, when we talk about the impact of the debt, we think about it in negative terms, right? Oh, wow, that means, that's crazy. We got this crisis. But the truth is that debt is being driven, is applauded in some ways by entrepreneurs. Why? Because that debt is being spent on things, on goods and services by the government. From whom? Mostly the private sector. And so what does that mean for an entrepreneur? It means sales revenue, it means income, it means profits for them. For the lenders, it means interest income through debt payments and profits for them. It means capital injections, because the receipt of funding from the government for contracts and the projects and the like represents capital for the entrepreneur. It might mean, by way of grants and loans, capital injection for the entrepreneur. But that loan or capital grant by the government is a part of its deficit scenario on borrowing needs. It means business opportunities. The government says, I have a need. And the entrepreneur says, okay, wow, if I'm creative enough, innovative enough, I can meet that need. So it becomes opportunities for entrepreneurs. For households, that spending, that deficit that is driving borrowing means household income. 22,000 employees in the government sector, and the current account deficit of the Bahamas is also always there. That means public infrastructure for economic efficiency, right? Because those households are also the ones who are going to use that income to buy and spend in the economy, and the economy gets to flourish also on the basis of that. There's human resource investment that's made by way of this government spending. There's public health improvements that's made or provided for by this government spending through this deficit and this borrowing, right? And there's provision of necessary, sometimes unnecessary public services that's provided by the government spending to the economy at large. And then there is sometimes just a sheer support of the economy in times of recession through what we call counter-cyclical fiscal operations. So the entrepreneur benefits from the government's spending, which exceeds almost in every year we've ever been independent. In the case of the Bahamas, its revenue, which leads to deficits, which have to be funded mostly by borrowing. And so you have that happening. And then, you'll notice I merged into the economy when I talked about the household income. So there are those benefits to the economy. So that's the spending side of the government's operation that contributes to the deficit, and then therefore the national debt. And then there's the taxing side. So here now the entrepreneur doesn't like the taxing, right? There's the formal taxation I talk about, which is when the government charges a VAT or charges a custom duty or the other. There's also the informal taxation, which I call waste and corruption. They are both taxes on the society. And that taxing leads to reduced investment capital for the entrepreneur, because if the government withdraws taxes or the government extracts taxes from the entrepreneur does not have that sum of money to make available for investing. So you have that. You have the reduced capital for research and development, because again, the government has extracted funds from the entrepreneur. And then you can have reduced training capital also, because the government is again extracting income from the entrepreneur. On the broader economy, you have reduced disposable income to the consumer. So that's going to have an effect on their ability to spend, on their ability to save. So you can have reduced saving, on their ability to invest. So you can have reduced investments, and that can have an impact on it, on the economy's further growth. And then you can have, through this this taxing and spending, and this deficit spending, you can have increased vulnerability to external shocks, as we have heard about and you've seen in the Bahamas, particularly on the foreign debt component, which is around, I think now 40+% for the Bahamas. And then you can have also, if this continues, this indebtedness continues to increase, you get an ever-increasing expenditure of the budget on debt servicing, which for the Bahamas now, I think stands at about 16% plus, maybe it could be higher. And then you have higher cost of borrowing, because you now find yourself in a vulnerable economic circumstances, and the international credit agencies say you are now a greater credit risk, and so they now downgrade you, and now you're looked at as more risky, and that leads to higher interest being paid by yourself. And then there's the ability to borrow in the future if things get so bad that you run up against the inability to pay. In these last remaining moments, let me say to you a couple of things insofar as solutions are concerned. I believe in debt cancellation if it can be had. It's not easy and unlikely to happen in many instances. So, but hey, try as you may. I believe in debt structuring. I mean, it just makes good sense that if you can restructure the debt so that maybe you term out over a longer period of time your payments, and so lower them so that you can free up some cash to do some necessary things, or you can maybe even get some portion of that, some build up in interest arrears canceled or to reduce, etc. There are lots of things around that. I believe in that, and where you can have that happen, then great, have it happen. But I believe the most practical path for countries, at least countries like the Bahamas, is really to have a slowdown and a more sustainable fiscal operation, so that you are not accruing debt as rapidly as we have been, and that your debt situation is more manageable. Now, let me say this, right? I do not, honestly, I think it is important for us to accept that the people who borrow on our behalf are adults. And most of them would think of themselves as fairly intelligent adults who are knowledgeable about what they're doing, especially since they have the benefit of technical advisors who are not politicians, but who are trained in these things. And we have to ask ourselves the question, like, is somebody forcing us to spend more than we earn? And if not, then why don't we spend less than we take in? And thereby reduce our deficits, and thereby reduce the pressure on our borrowings. Because that is totally within our control. I can't control that somebody else gives me a cancellation of debt or restructures my debt, but I can control the extent to which my debt continues to accrue, and so forth and so forth. Well, why don't we? Might I suggest to you that a part of the advocacy has to be in an education process for the entire society that says the more you demand of your politicians things that would cost money, and don't hold them accountable for spending that money within their means, and doing so probably by some legal instruments that have consequences tied to the same beyond just your voting them out, that if you can get to this kind of way, that maybe you can and we can bring that kind of pressure to bear on the politicians to say, you know what, spending within my means is now not even only sensible, it is now a requirement of the society I serve. And that by that, we can avert a future debt crisis because we are in control of managing the extent to which that debt accrues itself.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Randolph Minnis. I am the Chief Operating Risk Manager as well as the Treasury Manager for the Teachers and Salaried Workers Cooperative Credit Union. I'm just waiting for my slides to come up. There we go. I put part one here before I actually knew everything we were going to talk about today. So I'm not going to get to everything that I probably need to get to today. I'm hoping that I'll be invited back to do a part two and a part three. But I wanted to change the atmosphere a little bit because what we've been talking about so far this morning has been on the macro level. I want to change it up a little bit and have us focus a little bit on the micro level. So I want to focus my talk today on financial literacy because, as Shivago Lang said, we need to change the way we think about our finances. And it starts with us. It doesn't start with politicians. It doesn't start with MPs. It starts with us. If we have discipline within ourselves, we'll force them to have discipline in what they do for us. So we'll talk a little bit about financial literacy, why it's important. We'll talk about the lessons. I picked some lessons from the Central Bank Literacy Survey of 2018. And then we'll talk about understanding the importance at various stages of life. And actually, I'm going to end with an example of us having a national standard on literacy and how that would look like, especially for our guests here from Catherine. So I start with, when a poor man gets a little money, his thoughts go off in 10 different directions. What this is basically saying is if you have $100 in your pocket, once you break that $100, you don't know where they're going, right? And if we don't have discipline, that $100 can be gone in like five seconds. And it talks about no matter how much money you make, there's always ways to spend it. So don't think that the answer for you in your personal life is, oh, I need to raise a $500. I need another $1,000, so I need $2,000 more per month, and then I would not have problems with my finances. The more money you make, the more money you spend, which means that you find yourself more in debt. So I said I come from a credit union, and let me say why that's important. These are the 7 principles of a credit union. I won't go through all of them, but I'll just go through number 5. Credit unions are committed to education and training. Now, we work hand in hand with members at branches. We also teach in schools. We provide how-to videos, and Teachers and Salaried Workers Credit Union strives to break down communication barriers and to tackle financial topics to help our members live well. So how do we measure ourselves? We make sure that our members are doing better than they were last year, especially from a financial standpoint. So what's the layman's definition of financial literacy? It's a knowledge that empowers the masses with the ability to understand and manage finances wisely. Let me repeat that because a lot of people don't know that. It's a knowledge that empowers the masses with the ability to understand and manage finances wisely. And I said, what is knowledge? And it's the skills acquired through experience or education. And I think that's key. So I wanted to compare how our country handled various crises over the past couple of years, right? We had the COVID crisis. And what we did was we declared we had a national declaration on March 16, 2020 that was given by Dr. Dwayne Sands, right? Then we organized our budgets and our resources around the crisis, right? And they were able to provide routine reporting and press communications. even to the point where the government outlined individual responsibility and trained the nation how to properly wash our hands. Y'all remember those videos? You got to go in the bathroom, you got to wash your hands for 30 seconds, make sure you use soap and water and all that stuff. Yeah, so the government did all of that because they recognized the fact that COVID was a crisis. Now, we also have this thing where we have non-communicable diseases in the Bahamas, hypertension, diabetes, those type of things. Again, the government had a national declaration and they organized budgets around the crises but they don't have any reporting. They report every now and again, but they outlined individual responsibility and tried to train the country over time on how to diet and exercise. We even we were at the point where we had national workouts at the stadium. Did anybody attend the national? Okay, you did. Okay, awesome. See, so we know how to do that. But everyone in here recognizes the fact that we have a financial literacy crisis. So there's been no national declaration, right? To my knowledge, there's not been any government assigned budget or resources, right? No one's reporting on what's the status of our financial literacy, our knowledge, right? And there's no national program. There's no national standards to say, you know, by the time you hit grade 10, 11, 12, these are the skills and knowledge that you need to do and have in order to be an effective adult. So this is what, if you go to the government website, this is what is on their website related to healthy lifestyles initiatives. I apologize because the writing is kind of small because everyone's way in the back there, but there's nothing on financial literacy. There's nothing to help you to understand how to manage your finances. Whether you're an individual, whether you're an organization, whether you're a business. And so we can't, in the last presentation, Mr. Lang said that they're smart individuals surrounded by technocrats that understand how government finances and everything goes. But we have not outlined or made them accountable to us to do the same things that we have to do in our household, right? I want y'all to think about, in the first presentation, one of the things that they talked about is the debt to GDP, right? The Bahamas debt to GDP was 60%. I want you to take a minute and think about that. That means 60%, if the Bahamas was your household, that means 60% of everything that you make, you have to pay out to debt. That's before you buy food, right? That's before you pay for your house or your car or anything else. You got to pay 60% of your salary goes out to debt. So what happens when a country doesn't address a crisis, right? And I said, you know, what if they took the same attitude for COVID that they're taking for financial literacy, right? That means that persons will die, right? Persons will have long-term health challenges, right? We had travel and work restrictions. The health system itself is overwhelmed. Well, for us here in the financial literacy sphere, persons are also dying, right? Because if you don't have enough money to feed your family or to get the health care that you need, that's the result, right? If we don't address it, we'll continue to have the generational poverty cycles continue from time and time again. We also have increased crime pressure and the ability for persons to respond effectively after a crisis. One of the things that my team talked about is, you know, we're at a stage now where we're being affected every year by climate change and climate control, right? And so how do we manage our finances in order to address those things? We had a hurricane come through a couple of years ago, and come to find out almost 80 or 90% of the homes that were destroyed didn't have any insurance, none. So how do you then pick yourself up and move forward because you never had a plan? So what is the government's take on the Bahamas literacy? Well, The Deputy Prime Minister on, I think this is January 18th, 2023, laments the fact that Bahamians have poor saving and investing culture, right? I want to stress that Bahamians have a poor saving and investing culture. In fact, Deputy Prime Minister Chester Cooper said, noted that savings and investings are essential to building this nation's capital markets and spurring national growth. So in part two, I would talk more about what capital markets are, investing and all that other stuff. Still less than 30% of Bahamians contribute to pension plans and less than 8% invest in marketable securities. So that means 1 in 3 persons, working adults, has a plan for when they retire. That means 2 people that you'd meet on the street that are working today have no plan. No plan and nowhere to go once they get older. And they can't rely on national insurance because, as we know, one of the things that we didn't talk about today that's in part 2 is related to inflation. How does inflation affect your financial planning and what you're able to do with your money? So I'll just run through this real quick because my time is almost up because we only got 12 minutes. So roughly 34% of all respondents in the 2018 financial literacy survey were able to understand the compounding effect of interest on funds deposited in a bank account. The young lady right down there in the corner talked about the fact that when the country itself is paying these loans back, sometimes we pay 3 or 4 times more in interest than we pay on the loans. But take that back to your own personal, right, circumstance. How much interest do you pay on loans that you get from any financial institution over the life of the loan, right? The ability to assess the impact of the cost of living. Everybody knows that inflation is affecting us, but we have not quantified and said what that actually means to households. You know what it is when your family eats a dozen eggs a week and the price of eggs went from $4.50 to $9? Only 36% of Bahamian respondents understood that their spending power would remain the same if their incomes increase at the same rate as inflation, right? We didn't even talk about the fact that businesses should have some sort of mechanism to ensure that their staff have what is known as a COLA, which is a cost of living adjustment. If your inflation is at 3 or 5% per year and it's going up every year, that means a person that's making $20,000 this year, 3 years from now, effectively they're only making $17,000. The final skills test on that survey was whether or not individuals could calculate the interest rate being charged on a loan if they were given the dollar amount of interest paid. Now this is shocking. That means only 14% of adults were able to answer correctly. So that's 1 in 10, basically. Men were correct 18% of the time versus 10% for women. We didn't get into the man versus women thing, but I'm just saying, right? Financial literacy involves real behavioral changes regarding financial matters that set people up for financial stability. But what are the benefits of financial literacy? Improved rates of savings, lower levels of debt, and asset accumulation. How do we go from one generation to the next and we still don't have anything, right? Our grandmothers and grandfathers had homes and cars and lots in the family islands. We could barely purchase property now. And you probably won't be able to see this, so I'll just go through it real quick. Well, this is actually based on the United States. So 46% of low financial literacy persons reported learning from personal experience, while 73% of those with high literacy scores claim to learn from personal experience. So what this is saying is, if those that aren't educated, only 43% of them, they have to learn from experience. The bottom part is talking about when do we get our kids involved in financial literacy? When do we talk to them about money? It's not good enough to take them to the food store and say, no, Johnny, you can't have that. Or you can't have this candy, you can't have this, you can't have that. But you need to be in a position to explain to them why. I'll go through this real quick. So this is the pillars of financial literacy, right? Talks about spending, how do you spend your money, savings, how do you save your money? How have you ever had a conversation about earning an income, right? How you guys had conversations about earning income, what your first job should look like, what things you should consider when considering your first job, what are benefits, insurance, all that other stuff. Have you had a national conversation about investing? What about managing credit? And the last one is managing risk. So it's not enough to say, okay, I'm going to save this money, right? I'm going to save $500 a month, so that at the end of the year, I'm going to have $6,000. What if you get in a car accident, right? Or what if you have to go in and get a procedure, right? Do you have health insurance to cover those things?
Morning, I greet you on behalf of the wonderful actors involved with food and the many facets of agriculture. I'd like to call on my good friend, Mr. Lance Pinder, now to express to you what happened to him. He is the part owner and vice president of Abaco Big Bird. So Mr. Pinder will come on and tell us a little bit about what happened to Abaco Big Bird. Mr. Pinder, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Well, our company's been around for 27 years now. We've been through hurricanes in the past, obviously, survived through them. But when Dorian came through in 2019, it basically destroyed our whole company. We lost all our poultry producing capacity. All our citrus trees and orchards were completely destroyed. We lost about 40 to 50% of our avocado orchards. So we were completely, out of business. Fortunately, we did have insured whatever insurance companies would insure for a farm, which, as everyone knows, isn't usually a whole lot and can't make you completely whole again. But we decided to go back into the business with what funds we had available to us. And just as we started rebuilding and getting kind of our feet back on the ground after Dorian, COVID came along. So you could imagine what that did to the economy, and everything shut down and difficulty selling stuff and generating revenue. So a lot of our funds that we had for rebuilding was diverted to just keeping the company alive through the COVID pandemic. And then about the time that started easing up and, we could kind of maybe see our way to start really moving ahead again, all this inflation and supply chain problems and shortages happened. So the cost of production and producing has doubled in the last few years. So that's ate up more cash flow, as, obviously poultry, sort of like inventory, it costs you more to buy your stuff. So that's a carrying cost that you have that's doubled. And, as a company, we're just at the point where we're sort of out of resources. So we either have to go, because of all these shocks, we either have to go into a lot of debt right now, or we stay stagnant, or maybe we just shut down. And I think there's a lot of companies and businesses in the northern Bahamas that were impacted by Dorian and then COVID and now inflation that are in these very critical situations where they just can't tolerate much more and still be able to survive. And I mean, that's kind of our story and where we're at as a business. And because we're in food production, we've actually had a little more attention than a lot of other businesses in a sense, and a little bit of help. But it's not a pretty picture out there. You can still tell when you go to Abaco or Grand Bahama what happened here in 2019. It's still very evident.
I don't know if there's really anything else to say about it.
Well, thank you very much, sir.
No problem.
That story is one that can be repeated by many food producers and suppliers, or farmers, as you might think. They've experienced some very hard times. As a result of debt, deficits, and losses, some farmers have found it difficult to cope, and so they've just given up. My aim today and objective are to convey the importance of rebuilding the agriculture sector, not only during this time of severe food shortages, but to ensure sustainability and resilience in the future. I will explain how a serious approach to agriculture and the food production system can result in agriculture being the third pillar of our economy after tourism and financial services, while contributing significantly to health, social well-being, empowerment, jobs, GDP, and additional government revenues without any new taxes. I'd like first to call on Mr. Sean Miller, who was affected by Hurricane Matthew, to say a few words. Mr. Miller, are you there?
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? My name is Sean Miller, and I am the average local farmer here on the island of New Providence, Bahamas. I know it is a very short time, so I will get straight to the point. I'd like to start off with the year 2016. For most farmers, we were embattled in early 2016, dealing with the market, dealing with the competition from the US and pricing, and the average toils that a farmer goes through. But in late 2016 came Matthew. And although we are on the hurricane belt, no one really truly prepares fully for a hurricane when it arrives. It's unwelcome, but it came here on our island, and the damages that it caused was horrific. The livestock owners, the farmers, they were the first to recognize the losses that they had from Matthew. And then came the crops, I guess the fruits and vegetable farmers. At first, we thought we fared pretty well until the days drifted on, turned into weeks, and then all the crops, all the trees started to turn brown, and we realized the amount of damage that we sustained from Hurricane Matthew. It was due to the fact that it was reported here on Bonefish Pond itself that the waters were way over 8 feet high, and it took such a long time for the waters to subside. We had horrific, like I said, damages from Matthew, and what happened in the years following was the damages had caused us such a tremendous setback that when the government had called a meeting with all the farmers immediately after Matthew, it was a disruptive meeting, and the main reason was we all knew that whatever the government was offering would not have been a substantial enough funding to get us back on our feet. So most farmers were very, very concerned, and you know, what happened with the years following was this left most of the farmers, myself included, depleted. We did not have a means for having financing, and let's get the loan out of the equation. Most farmers know better than to borrow, because without even a loan to pay off, we're struggling. We're always in a struggle trying to just make ends meet. So after Matthew, what had happened was most of the farmers were not only depleted, we felt abandoned, we felt defeated. And we had to struggle to get back to where we were just before COVID. And then unexpectedly, no one was expecting this thing called COVID. When COVID came around, that was pretty much very, very near the end for most of the farmers. And we were trying to figure out how are we going to survive. Seeing that I have the heirs of the international body, we've been through from Matthew to now 3 different political administrations, and they have all tried a little, but it was insufficient. And I do believe that the funding that is brought on by the politicians, the government, is far insignificant to make a substantial change. So we're calling on the international body to please consider the amount of natural disasters and also this new monster that is coming around, something that we did not play a part in. The machine that reaps havoc on Mother Earth that we label and call global warming is not, it does not profit us any which way. There are larger countries out there that makes a profit from their industries, the industrial countries. And now I think it is only fair that certain fundings be available to smaller countries in the Caribbean, including us here in the Bahamas, because we are catching such a difficult time. And we want to make a statement that unless some funding is made to us, then we would not be able to carry out our duties to help sustain sustainable food security here on this global planet called Earth. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I'm not going to tell you anything about Hurricane Matthew. I'm not going to tell you anything about Hurricane Dorian. And I'm not going to tell you anything about COVID-19. I think those topics have been covered, but I have a lot I could say. I want to talk to you a little bit about challenges. Food producers and suppliers. And I put them all in one category because you have crop farmers, you have livestock farmers, you have beekeepers, you have fisher folk, you have processors, all of us who provide food. Well, first of all, we need your support, but all of those I consider food producers and suppliers. They don't have any access, especially the farmers, to crop insurance, which you would have heard earlier. But they also suffer from something called perdile larceny. Now, that might be a new word, and the lawyers here would know what I'm talking about, but it simply means that you grow your stuff and people go behind you and reap your harvest before you get a chance. Sometimes even before they're full, they're ready for harvesting, they go and they take them. The availability of food and access to it is still threatened. The high cost of food imports to the Bahamas is unsustainable. Inflation is a vexing problem. I'm going to jump and say, sadly, a number of farmers are discouraged. They need a ray of hope. What can food producers do, though, to help themselves? We must recommit to the task at hand. We must collaborate where there are synergies. We must come together cooperatively to achieve economies of scale. We must not depend on government alone. We must keep records. We must seek to acquire knowledge and learn new methods. We must find ways to reduce costs and expenses. We must establish a seed and food bank. We must eliminate the use of expensive fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. We must train in food safety, SPS and HACCPs. We must understand markets and logistics. So we've had some help and support. The government, our government has helped despite budget constraints, but the resources of foods producers and suppliers are depleted. So when we talk about debt and national debt, we understand that we're going to be on the lower end of the totem pole, but we shouldn't be there because you have to eat every day. You have to eat every day. So we have to consider what we're going to do to help you to eat every day. So the government might not have funding, but they can assist with policies we can access. There are benefits, concessions, and programs that are on the books right now and can be made available to us. New policies, the government should be encouraged to create new policies, especially those related to technology, innovation, and automation. And we can assist the government with their pledge to CARICOM to lower imports by 25% by 2025. This is a pledge that more than that because Sean touched on that a little bit. But we just want those agencies to know that even though our country might have a high income per capita, the people we're trying to help are never at that level. They don't make the kind of money that cause our average to be so high. And then we want to let them know that we can assist them with the decade of family planning, family farming, which started in 2019. I was in Rome at the time when that was declared, and it goes until 2028. And also the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we can help them make a reality. Solutions. We must introduce an automated agriculture and food production system, complete with traceability, coding, and media. Imagine taking your smartphone to access the app, to purchase your goods from the digital e-commerce platform, complete with current information and prices. There is now a supply chain fully automated with complete connectivity. Producers can now supply more certified organic crops, meats, and seafoods. This will incorporate many forms of technology from farm to market and from seed to table. We must conduct an inventory of the sector by collecting data in the form of an agriculture census. This census will provide the foundation for our collective decisions for government policy. We just don't know what we have and what's here. We must incorporate digitalization in agriculture and climate smart agriculture with the use of greenhouses and container farming. Every island should develop fish farming to produce more counts, shrimp, fish, and seafood. Let's develop alternative energy sources, starting with the family islands. Permaculture and agroecology will become the new farming methods. We must plant more fruit and native trees on all the islands everywhere. First of all, fruit trees will give you something to eat. We got more trees, it brings rain clouds, we get rainfall to harvest water for farming. We know that the islands with the trees, New Providence, Abaco, Grand Bahama, and Andros get rainfall. So let's plant trees in those southern Bahama Islands and get rainfall there too. We should encourage more backyard gardening and community farms. We should plant more mangroves, shrub, plants and trees along the coastline to secure our beaches and coast. And what are the benefits? Very quickly. Producers will become almost debt-free. In fact, our country could be debt-free if we didn't have an appetite for the now. Let's wait until tomorrow for the things that we can't afford today. Non-communicable diseases are an all-time high. We'll begin to decrease that with good food and a good approach to how we should live. Technology in farming will encourage more young people in agriculture as the jobs related to agriculture move indoors. I'm sorry the young people left before I told them that. And on the computer and cell phones. There will be jobs for everyone, including the disabled workers. Government will benefit with increase in NIB contributions for all the taxes, but we'll also help with the balance of payments. We'll help to increase GDP. We'll reduce our need for expending our foreign reserves, and every island will reduce, and with every island participating, we will reduce our imports, and those funds circulate and empower our people. With new hope, jobs, and empowerment, we should even see a reduction in crime. Conclusion. We must act now and act fast. Imagine a country where people are happy and hopeful. There will be no need to allocate additional funds to the Ministry of Health, the prisons, Simpson, Penn, and Willamette Pratt, Social Security. Those funds can go towards specialized education, where we educate our people to do the things that are necessary to enrich and encourage our country to grow. Thank you very much.
Question relative to farming entrepreneurs. How can the government, or what are you doing to get the government to make a policy for banks to give persons in the agriculture and also entrepreneurial field? You go to the bank, they don't want to give you any
To invest, because they're saying, somehow or the other, you can't show where you next year you're going to have income coming in and stuff like that. So that's a challenge. And the next thing that I wanted to ask is, what are you doing to encourage the young persons? And like I say, they're not here. What are you doing to encourage the young persons to go into farming and fishing? Because we have maritime training and it's not working.
I suspect that's Mr. Thompson.
I mentioned that we need to incorporate technology and automation in agriculture. And my organization has developed a complete project which could show you how we can incorporate technology. We have, because we're in so many countries in the Caribbean, we're in 11 countries, we're working towards seeing how we can do that in all of them, because all of these Caribbean countries are suffering from the same thing. We might think, well, this is only Bahamas, but no. Their kids are leaving home, our kids leave the family islands and come to Providence. But we must find a way to localize things. And so one day, maybe soon, we'll talk about how we can do it without costing us money. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope Mr. Shivago Lang is still on the line.
I am, yes. I'm still here.
Okay then, good afternoon, sir. My question is directed to you. You spoke about waste and corruption in the fiscal management. So my question is, knowing this, how can we be disingenuous and asking for a write-off on our debt, but at the same time, we still have waste and corruption going on? How do we merge the two?
Well, I'm not entirely sure who's asking for debt relief or reduction in debt relief in the Bahamas or cancellation in the Bahamas, but I mean, some element of waste is inherent in human conduct, even in your own lives. My life, we have waste. We have food spoiled because we bought too much of it, etc. So some element of waste is going to exist, and the work to continue to reduce and eliminate waste is always an important part of organizational management. Corruption too is also part and parcel of the human experience. I mean, you know, you can't control everyone. People are going to take advantage of circumstances, and you know, in your head you may just be thinking it's the politician, but you know, it's the civil servant who takes money from someone to get something done, and the person who gives the money, they're both corrupt because they're both corrupting the system. And they're human beings, and that happens. So that the fact that they exist has nothing to do with pursuing a debt strategy leading toward a lower debt, maybe even elimination of debt or more manageable debt. And so the two of those to me are not mutually exclusive at all. That would almost be like saying, how can I ask for a scholarship for my child when I know that maybe I have wastage going on in my house? I mean, you know, you work on the wastage, but the child needs a scholarship.
Well, I personally feel like, Mr. Menace, your message today was the best, because our country need to know how to manage money. Our young people need to know the value of money. I applaud you for your effort today, but my question has to go to Mrs. Shivago-Lang, because I had this question when he first spoke. Yes, sir. Yes, because I was so touched by your representation, Mr. Shivago-Lang. But this question bothered my mind. Our first Prime Minister served for 25 years. And you said 1994, our debt was just about $1 billion. I need you, as one who would have served as a Minister of State in Finance, to explain to me how 4 prime ministers who would have served for 30 years after this one prime minister served for 25 years, and they run up a debt of $9 billion. Do we have a challenge where government change, or should we as a people allow one government to run for at least 10, 15 years? Because that's what the first prime minister would have done. Answer that for me, sir.
Well, I think it's unfortunate that I probably started in 1994, because the truth of the matter is, when Sir Lyndon came to office, there was no debt in the country at all. Very so. And so if you look at that versus the 900 million that built up since, it would have been, you would call that an astronomical increase in the debt under his tenure over those 25 years. And so certainly as a matter of annual increase, it would have been much more. But he had that much more work to do in bringing the country from a place of infrastructural and development deficiency to a place where it became a more developed country. And so it isn't a question of Sir Lyndon, of somebody staying in longer or shorter, because to be honest with you, in the period of time between 1993 and 1999, we had the slowest growth in our debt of all the administrations. We had deficits that were around 1%. We haven't seen that kind of sustained slow deficit in our history, right? And so you have to look a little bit more deeply at it. The bottom line for us is do you want to compel your political leadership responsible for your money to spend more within their means? And if you do, what is the means by which to do that? That's really the bottom line. There's no other way to manage debt outside of spending within your means. There's no other way.
Again, I was very heartened to hear the experiences of the hurricanes on various sectors and the various speakers who would have given from a broader perspective on debt to intimately what happens within particular sectors and businesses. So for that reason, I felt that this was a very engaging session. It really gave me a lot to think about as someone who is as a practitioner in the field. I thoroughly enjoyed hearing the perspective of Bahamas. And in my mind, I was comparing it to how Trinidad and Tobago is affected, how Barbados, where I am now, is affected, and other stories I would have heard throughout the Caribbean, and I continue to monitor. So I'm aware there are 2 more national consultations that are coming up. So I am even more interested and eager to see how it is built out, how the story, the discourse, the narrative continues to be built out as we get deeper and deeper into the discourse. So I would like to thank the CSB, the Civil Society Bahamas, for putting on this particular session. I think it is worthwhile, it is timely, it is extremely relevant to Dr. Hamilton and his team, and to the students. It was quite heartening as well to see the students there making an input, because the need for the younger generation to be a part of this discourse and understand how their future could be affected by this, it counts for a lot. Thank you to all the speakers again and all the participants. It has been a very engaging session. The questions, I took notes of a number of the questions as well for myself to go and do a little added research on. So I look forward to the 2 sessions, and I hope that everyone has a fantastic afternoon, and take care and see you all soon again.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And Ms. Oliveri basically did part of the vote of thanks for me, so I thank her. But nonetheless, it's a privilege to give the vote of thanks. And I want to, first of all, thank you who have remained. And as Ms. Oliveri said, this is really just the first of our national consultations, and others will come. Because of the specific time that we gave, many had to leave. But those of you who are here, if you think this first formal launch and the national consultations was worth your while, could you give a shout for yourselves and those who are not here? Thank you. Of course, one can never be totally exhaustive in giving a vote of thanks, because there's so many unsung heroes that make something a success. But of course, I have to single out some, and I would first like to single out our partners, the Caribbean Policy Development Center, specifically Ms. Oliveri, Mr. Rambaran, and our international partner, Debt Justice UK, Mr. Jerome Phelps. I would next like to single out Dr. Jacinta Higgs, because it was through her initiative. She saw this project online and she took it to our president, Dr. Anthony Hamilton. And despite some competition, Civil Society Bahamas was privileged to have obtained this project. So I salute Dr. Jacinta Higgs. I'd also like to thank the Civil Society Bahamas team that brought this formal launch and this first national consultation into being. It definitely wouldn't have happened, and I have to particularly emphasize our president, Madam Valderine Hamilton as well, and Madam Kimberly Miners. Of course, I have to thank our moderator, Dr. Olivia Saunders, who kept us flowing along and who gave substantive insight into the debt profile of the Bahamas. I also want again to thank Madam Hamilton, because I think you can call her the queen of icebreakers. Then there's no question. I think all of you would agree that both on our partner side, regional and international, as well as nationally, we had excellent presenters, didn't we? So thank you again, CPDC, Debt Justice UK. Thank you, Mr. Lime. Thank you, Mr. Minnis. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I also want to thank one of our directors, Director Sherry Benjamin, because she is the president of one of the biggest trade unions and most significant trade unions in our country. BCPOU, Bahamas, please help me, Bahamas Communications. Bahamas Communications Public Officers Union. She is their president. This is their premise. This is their hall. Thank you, Director Benjamin. And then last but not least, I want to thank Choices Restaurant from the University of the Bahamas, who supplied us with the refreshments. So again, I emphasize this thanks goes to those I have specified, but also to all the unsung heroes that made this event possible. And I want to close by saying that, as was indicated through some of our presenters, particularly the local presenters, that we want to be sure that something tangible, sustainable comes out of this exercise. And this was epitomized, I think, particularly with the presentation, well, actually with all. They all gave us food for thought as how we could move forward in a practical way. But I want to underscore that we, the Civil Society Bahamas team, we are also doing the same. And I want to leave you with two practical ways that we have already started the process. One is that, as Mr. Randolph Minnis indicated, we have already started the process for a certified financial literacy program for the youth of the Bahamas. We will be launching today a new website or a new portal on the Civil Society Bahamas website called Civil Society CSB Debt Justice, where you will find practical tools to answer the questions that were raised by our presenters and by the participants. And you will see tips, you will see tools, you will see training, you will see templates, you will see talents. In other words, these are some of the headings. The talents refer to all those dreams and ideas that you would have had. We're going to show you how to bring them into fruition. And lastly, with respect to the new portal, we also want you to go there and fill out a survey. The survey is a personal financial checkup, so that as you benefit from the CSB Debt Jubilee portal, you yourself, even as an adult, can not only gain financial literacy, but gain financial help, and all the dreams and visions you had for economic empowerment shall come to pass. I thank you.
Those on you online, it is in the chat, csbdebtjubilee.com. It is in the chat for you. Thank you. csbdebtjubilee.com.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all. Enjoy your day. Be debt free.